The sun was slowly sinking behind the red cliffs of the Arizona desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The evening air had begun to cool, and the long shadows of cottonwood trees stretched across the quiet land. Daniel Carter guided his horse along a narrow trail beside the San Pedro River, enjoying the calm after a long day of work on his small ranch. The sound of the river moving over smooth stones was steady and peaceful, mixing with the distant calls of birds preparing for the night. Daniel liked riding along the river at this time of day. It gave him time to think. The desert could be harsh and lonely, but moments like this made it feel almost gentle. His horse walked slowly, its hooves crunching softly against the sandy ground. Then something unusual broke the quiet. At first, Daniel thought it was the cry of a bird, but when he listened more carefully, he realized it was something else entirely. It was the sound of a child crying. The sound came faintly from below the trail, somewhere near the water. Daniel quickly pulled the reins and stopped his horse. He sat still for a moment, listening again. The cry came once more, thin and frightened, carried by the breeze. Daniel frowned and slid down from his saddle, leaving his horse tied to a nearby tree. He carefully made his way down the rocky slope toward the riverbank. Loose stones shifted under his boots as he climbed down. When he reached the bottom, he finally saw the source of the sound. A small boy sat alone on a wet rock near the edge of the river. The child looked no older than 4 years old. His dark hair hung messily around his face, and his small clothes were soaked with river water. His feet were bare, scratched by the sharp stones along the bank. The boy was clearly Apache. He hugged his knees tightly and cried softly, his small body shaking from the cold. Daniel slowly stepped closer, careful not to frighten him. The river behind the child was wide and restless, the current stronger than usual from melting snow in the distant mountains. Daniel looked around the area, scanning the hills and trees for any sign of a nearby camp or riders. But there was nothing. No horses, no voices, no smoke from a fire. The child had somehow been separated from his people, left alone beside a dangerous river as the desert night approached. Daniel stood for a moment beside the frightened child, listening to the rushing sound of the river. The current looked stronger than it had earlier in the day, swollen by melting snow from the distant mountains. The water moved quickly around the rocks, forming small waves that slapped against the riverbank. Daniel knew that even a grown man had to be careful crossing a river like this. The little boy continued to cry softly, rubbing his cold hands together. His small shoulders trembled, and his wet clothes clung tightly to his thin body. Daniel could see fresh scratches on the child's bare feet, likely from trying to walk across the sharp stones near the water. The boy must have tried to cross the river with his people and somehow slipped away from them in the confusion. Daniel slowly knelt down a few feet away so he would not scare the child. He spoke gently, even though he knew the boy might not understand his words. "It's all right, son. You're safe now," he said quietly. The child looked at him with wide, uncertain eyes. His dark face was streaked with tears, and for a moment he seemed unsure whether to run or stay still. But he was too cold and too tired to move. He simply watched Daniel carefully. Daniel glanced again at the river. If the boy's tribe had crossed to the other side, they were likely searching for him already. But the sun was dropping quickly, and darkness in the desert came fast. If the child stayed here much longer, the cold night air could become dangerous. He also knew something else. Helping an Apache child was not always simple. Many settlers and tribes did not trust each other, and misunderstandings could easily turn into trouble. If the warriors returned and saw him alone with their child, they might assume the worst. But leaving the boy here was not an option. Daniel slowly reached forward and held out his hands, showing the child he meant no harm. After a moment of hesitation, the boy allowed Daniel to lift him from the cold rock. The child was light, barely more than a bundle of wet clothes and shivering limbs. Daniel gently placed the boy on his shoulders so the child could hold onto his neck. Then he stepped carefully toward the edge of the river. The water was cold the moment his boots touched it. Taking a deep breath, Daniel began walking into the strong current, determined to carry the child safely across. Daniel had barely caught his breath after the difficult river crossing, when he noticed something unsettling in the distance. At first, it was only a faint movement along the ridges beyond the riverbank. Then a thin cloud of dust began rising into the evening air. Daniel's eyes narrowed as he watched the horizon carefully. He knew that kind of dust. Riders. Within moments, the shapes became clearer. Dark figures on horseback moved quickly across the desert hills, heading straight toward the river. The fading sunlight reflected off metal and polished wood. There was no doubt now. Apache warriors. Daniel felt a knot tighten in his chest. He knew how this could look. A stranger standing beside an Apache child near the river might easily be mistaken for a kidnapper or enemy. Even though he had saved the boy, the warriors approaching from the hills didn't know that yet. The little boy was still sitting on the ground beside him, watching quietly. His crying had stopped, and his breathing had finally calmed. He looked toward the approaching riders and suddenly stood up with excitement. Within minutes, the riders reached the riverbank. About 10 Apache warriors surrounded Daniel, their horses moving in a slow circle around him. The animals snorted softly, their hooves pressing into the sandy ground. Each rider carried weapons, rifles slung over shoulders and bows tied to saddles. Their faces were serious and unreadable. Daniel slowly raised both of his hands to show he meant no harm. He stayed still, knowing that any sudden movement might make the situation worse. The air became very quiet. One of the warriors, a tall man with sharp eyes and long dark braids, seemed to be their leader. He studied Daniel carefully from atop his horse, saying nothing. The other riders remained silent, watching every movement. Suddenly the little boy ran forward. He rushed toward one of the warriors and grabbed his leg tightly. The warrior quickly climbed down from his horse and knelt beside the child. He checked the boy's arms, shoulders, and feet, making sure he wasn't injured. The boy began speaking quickly in Apache, pointing toward Daniel and then toward the river behind them. His small hands moved excitedly as he tried to explain what had happened. The warriors listened closely, their eyes shifting from the child to Daniel. For several long seconds, no one spoke. Daniel stood in the center of the silent circle, unsure whether he had just saved a life or stepped into something far more dangerous. The desert had grown, quiet as the final moments of daylight slipped behind the distant mountains. The sky was now filled with deep shades of orange and fading gold, and the long shadows of the riders stretched across the sandy ground near the riverbank. Daniel Carter stood still in the center of the circle of Apache warriors, his hands slowly lowering back to his sides. No one had told him to move, but no one had told him to stay still either. The boy continued speaking quickly to the warrior who had knelt beside him. His small voice carried urgency as he pointed, first at Daniel and then toward the river. They had just crossed. The warrior listened carefully, his expression calm but serious. When the boy finished, the man stood up slowly and placed a steady hand on the child's shoulder. The other riders waited in silence. The leader of the group finally guided his horse forward a few steps until he stood directly in front of Daniel. His eyes studied the rancher carefully, as if trying to measure the truth behind the boy's story. Daniel could feel the weight of every warrior's gaze resting on him. For a moment, the only sound was the river flowing behind them. The leader then looked toward the water. His eyes followed the strong current moving between the rocky banks. It was clear he understood what kind of crossing it had been, especially for a small child. Slowly, he turned his attention back to the boy, who was now standing quietly beside the warrior who had checked him for injuries. Without speaking, the leader gave a small nod. It was a simple gesture, but its meaning was clear to everyone present. The boy had told them that Daniel carried him across the dangerous river when he could not cross alone. The tension in the circle faded almost instantly. One of the warriors gently lifted the child and placed him onto a horse in front of him. The boy looked back at Daniel with wide eyes, no longer afraid. The leader looked at Daniel one last time. There were still no words, but there was something different in his expression, now something closer to respect. Then he turned his horse. One by one, the Apache riders followed him. Hooves moved quietly across the desert ground as the group began riding back toward the hills they had come from. As the sun finally disappeared beyond the horizon, The riders faded into the growing darkness. Daniel remained by the river, watching until the last shape vanished into the evening.